Hello, welcome to No Veto Video. I'm Katherine.
And I'm Carson. And this week we're going to be telling you all about These Final Hours from 2013. Written and directed by Zach Hilditch and starring Nathan Phillips and Angourie Rice.
These Final Hours thinks about a world in which we all know that the world is coming to an end, and it's coming to an end last in Australia. So they have a particularly long amount of time to think about how they want to spend their final hours. It follows one particular character as he struggles to figure out how to spend that time well.
I picked this movie. I've seen it before. It sounded interesting when I first watched it. I didn't know what to expect. After watching it, I really liked a lot of how they dealt with interpersonal issues under the stress of the world ending. I like the cinematography, the nice muted tones that really give a sense of urgency or just despair even. As Catherine commented to me while we watched it, everyone looked extremely hot, and it looked like they were hotter than would normally be. For even some of the parts of Australia that are extremely hot. So it kind of gave you the sense of the world's overheating. And something that I've noticed in Australian movies that American cinema doesn't really get right in most cases is it really focuses, at least in these kind of movies, on the gritty details of how people feel their inner turmoil during these times, whereas American movies under a same situation typically go with violent shoot-'em-up type things.
Or the sense of, like, we can set it right again.
Or, yeah.
I'm thinking about, like, Day After Tomorrow, which is this idea of, like, if we will by heroic effort overcome this, and that's certainly not that's not the story that These Final Hours is trying to tell.
No, this is a much more bleak story where everyone's just resigned to their fate.
Yeah. You're right about the look of the movie. I always experienced some parts of Australian cinema as sort of, I'm going to say the word overbaked, and I don't mean it negatively, but just the sort of sense of, like, everyone's been out in the sun, and the landscape has been out in the sun, and the pervasive presence of the sun sort of drives everything along. And you get a lot of that here, but even for that, there was just sort of it's like everything is shot at golden hour. Like, everything is shot at the end of the day, like when the tones are the most golden. And it's sort of this idea of this is the period just before dusk. Like, this is what comes just before dark. That also kind of thematically fits.
Yeah. So, I know you seem to have some issues with the movie. Would you like to discuss those?
So, one of my issues with this film is about, I'm going to say depravity, and I'm going to end up sounding like the typical, like, American Puritan. And I don't mean it that way, but that, like, I don't know that Australia has this much coke in it. Like, just that much. And some of the other, like, things that it chose to spend a lot of film time showing us, I'm not sure how necessary they were. And then my other, like, quibble, and is just that, like, the pacing of some of, and I guess it can go back to the other thing, is like we spent a long time on things that I felt we should have spent a very, very short time on, and then we spent nearly no time on what I thought were more interesting. So, I mean, it's one of those, you know, you're locked into the story that the filmmaker is going to tell you. And it was sort of like being shown all of these interesting avenues and then being forced down the, like, oh, well, I didn't really care about that avenue, and, like, I don't really need you to spend more time there. So much so that at the very, very, very end of the film, they take one last little detour, and it's like, we don't have time for this. Like, you blew all of the time that we might have needed to make this an interesting segment, and all of these previous scenes. So, yeah, those are my 2 quibbles.
The ending did feel a bit rushed. It felt like there was a lot of emotion going on that they just jam-packed into...
Like, oh wow, that's like years and years of conflict.
Or like an hour crying scene that was cut into 20 seconds so they could have the 20-second makeup scene with the 30-second dying scene.
Right, yeah, just before the world ends.
Yeah, whereas each of those could have been most of the movie. But I believe the reason they did this, spent most of the time on like partying or the violence, is I believe the filmmaker thought that would be the bulk of what would happen in a situation like this. A lot of people would turn to drugs to try to forget. A lot of people would turn to, or as one character said, to just not feel anything. I think a lot of people might turn to violence because what does it matter? The world's going to end in a few hours. So I think they were just trying to show that this would be the bulk of it by taking the bulk of the time to...
I mean, sure. I don't know how compelling that defense is for me. I think in some really important ways, too, this is another one of those main characters who doesn't say a whole lot. And we've had a couple of those guys in the last, few episodes. I'm thinking especially of the episode Stakeland. Go back and watch that. As we respond to that. But this fella has a lot of interiority, as opposed to the character of Mr. in Stakeland. And this guy's interiority, though, is never given exteriority. I could see that there's a lot going on for this fella, in the background. And it's a credit, really, to Nathan Phillips in the role. But so much of the sort of philosophical heavy lifting of the movie is turned over to this sort of radio announcer character who comes in anytime there's these long driving sequences. And there are several long driving sequences, which actually makes me, as an American, feel very... there are these times where you're alone in the car and there's just this sort of rumination, and it almost feels like everything that can come on the radio feels like it has something to say to you about what you're going through. I guess unless you're Morrissey. But for me, it's this sense of like, well, that's great, I'm hearing from this rando radio voice, but what I really kind of want to be hearing, or at least having a better sense of, is what's going on for the James character. And even there's this one point where he introduces himself as James, and that doesn't work, and then he has to say it's Jimmy, which is like an interesting character moment of like, I'm claiming this other self, but the only way you've known me is this more kind of immature self. That kind of way of talking about the name.
You make a good point with the character development, or lack thereof. There were a couple of fully fleshed out characters that actually felt like they grew through the movie. James is one. I don't remember the child's name. Rose. Rose was another one. But a lot of the other characters, even ones we've seen a lot of screen time on, felt either very one-dimensional or underdeveloped. Some of them, they just didn't feel like they even gave a personality.
I'm thinking especially, so James's idea is basically he's going to go from one place to another place to leave the people he was with in the first scene to go and spend the last moments in this other place. And when he gets there, there's this girlfriend character, there's sort of a brother-in-law character, and the girlfriend character especially, as a woman watching this, was very repulsive to me. Is sort of like this is sort of the adult woman that gets the most lines, almost.
Mm-hmm.
Just about. Maybe his mom. And she's awful. Like, not just a bad human being, but an strange credulity. Like, a not real human being.
Yeah.
Like, nobody, even in this, even in extremis, would be like this. And it just, it was a difficult performance to watch.
And I want to back up a little bit to when he first got to the rather large house with the party that you were just talking about. He even has reservations. You can tell by the expression on his face, his actions, a couple of the comments he says. And Rose pipes up at that point, and Rose, through a lot of the movie, kind of feels like his conscience.
In a lot of ways. A very kind of Jiminy Cricket kind of character, yeah. And basically says, I thought you'd be with somebody better, and
yeah.
He has to sort of own that. And
don't drink and drive. And yeah, just all through the movie.
So, the movie itself makes some interesting stylistic choices.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of how it goes about visually telling the story. And I think my complaint about the lack of interiority is in some ways, if you take that instead of saying it's non-sequential storytelling, as to say it's checking in sort of with his mental landscape, and so that instead of seeing something that is yet to happen or seeing something that has already happened, what we are in fact seeing is sort of his ruminative consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked those touches. It made this film stylistically a lot more interesting than some that we've watched.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely there was a lot of flashbacks, flash forwards, a few flash forwards, and those were most likely him remembering, as you said, or possibly thinking to the future and, like we all do, just relaying possibilities in our head.
Mm-hmm. And sort of the desired place.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate those such as they're handled quietly, they're handled seamlessly, and in the sort of way that, while you're sort of zoning out and you're not daydreaming, but you're not really paying attention to what you're doing, that these images or thoughts kind of come into your consciousness. I liked that.
You raised a good point about his desired outcomes. All of the future scenes that we would see would be, under the circumstances, probably the best possible outcome. So it's definitely, he's got a positive spin on his outlook, even through, and he always did sometimes begrudgingly what was right. So he did have this sense of, even though the world is ending, we still don't have to be horrible people.
Right. Speaking of the world is ending and we don't have to be horrible people, there was an awful lot of the world is ending and now is our chance to be as horrible as we can possibly be.
And then some.
And then some. And in the nude, which, again, American, Australian, it's different sensibilities, but yeah, boy, if you don't like butts, this is not the film for you.
I thought while watching it, I realize you're going to be dead in 4 hours, but really, that sunburn's going to hurt.
Hello, this review brought to you by the Mole People. We spend as little time outside as humanly possible.
We're awfully pale if you can't tell.
We would be called the Indoor Kids if that wasn't already an excellent podcast. Yeah, we think about such things. Maybe in Australia the math is a little bit different. But no, I think the world is ending in 4 hours. Now is the time for child rape that I always wanted to do but never had a time. What? no, like,
or murder, or I mean, there were all sorts of crimes going on.
yeah, it's sort of like we saw very few examples of goodness, and what examples of goodness we saw were like people checking out early, as they term it in this.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this sort of sense of I don't know, left behindedness almost about it. Yeah.
I'm assuming you mean the feeling of being left behind, not the sketchy fiction.
Sketchy fiction, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the idea of like all the good people are gone or leaving, and what's left behind are just the bad people.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page.
No. Sketchiness all the way. Sketchiness all around.
Yeah. I could see that from my limited experience with that series.
Yeah, I know. Coming to it blind. Yeah.
I thought some of the scenes at the party were a little odd. Like, there was this, it looked like fairly large tournament of Russian roulette. And I know you commented that's the only time, whereas if you lose, you win. But it seemed like an odd way to... It was kind of a lottery to check out early in a way.
I suppose so, yeah. Yeah, and so there is this one sequence of scenes, short scenes, vignettes, I guess, I suppose, that takes place in a very different looking spot. A place more idyllic, greener and lusher. In fact, the whole sort of sun-bakedness of the rest of the film sort of retreats a bit. We get sort of this green, quiet, peaceful moment that's really very welcome, as if for nothing else than to set sort of textually a different environment. We've gone from like an overly loud, overly obnoxious sort of place, with one stopover, to this greener place, and that it is in that greener place that Rose, the child, says, "This is where I'm supposed to be. This is my spot where I'm gonna face out this thing." And I think there's something symbolic about that.
Her character developed a lot through the movie. When we first meet her, and even about halfway through our encounters with her, she seems a lot less mature than she does in that moment.
There is, I think, for Rose, this way in which she has a piece about finding where it is you're supposed to be that's different than maturity.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's something about having a place in the world to exist, like a key finding its keyhole. Like when you've gotten to the spot where you're supposed to be, there's a kind of peace in that moment. And that's what, for me, the symbolism of the green is about. Some people say that green is a color of hope, which, okay, fine. But for me, it's very much a color of peace. And so seeing it for the first time in this film kind of has that sense of, this is what it looks like when you settle into the place where you're supposed to be.
Okay.
And so I think so the arc for Rose isn't really one of like growing up or maturity. It's an exemplar arc of, this is what getting to that spot looks like. And it's something like James has neither Rose's clarity of like purpose nor her commitment to like that place. So he is running around not sure what he should do and not even sure of where he's supposed to be. And the message of this film is very much, there's a place that you're supposed to be. There's a place that I'm supposed to, like, that we're all supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that finding that place is very, very important.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but I don't want to give spoilers, but when he's at the party, there's a place that Vicky, his girlfriend, and her brother feel they're supposed to be, and he just breaks their whole outlook on that, and that causes a lot of tension.
Well, and in his rejection, so they feel like they've made a place for him to be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, Jimmy, this is where you're supposed to be. And then he sort of says, I shouldn't be here, but not only should I not be here, you shouldn't be here either. But even just the idea of him rejecting the place that they made for him is that it kind of, like, even just saying, this isn't the place for me, diminishes their joy in the place that they feel like they've found for themselves. Yeah. Thanks.
And at the beginning and end, the person he's with at both of those scenes definitely feels like that is a place she is supposed to be.
Yes. She has clarity.
And there would be nothing that would move her from there.
Nope.
So yeah, you're right. That is definitely a common theme throughout the entire movie. So, any final thoughts?
There is a refrain that James likes to use throughout the movie. It's sort of like a, you should listen to me. I kind of have, I have clarity on the situation. Even though he's, as we've just described, lacking in clarity on the situation. But he is clear on one thing, which is that we are all already dead. We're already dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting thing to think about. I think that's what gives the philosophy of this film its teeth, which is the idea of, like, who do we want to be if we accept our own mortality? Like, if we really lived into our own mortality. I once knew a woman who had, for a time in her early adulthood, been a sister in a very, very strict French order, and, you know, lived a religious life. And they would spend a few hours every day contemplating their own mortality. As sort of an idea of, like, if we really lived into the fact that the time that we have here on Earth is limited, whether it be just a few hours or just the fact that we know that there will be a time when we aren't here anymore, would that change how we go about living our lives? And I think that question, and it's the question that I think Hilditch is trying to really ask in this movie, and it's why it's titled what it is, that has a compelling element to it for me. So, now, I don't know what the answer to that is. I often have this at my departmental meetings. They ask me for final thoughts, and I say, here's an interesting question we haven't even dug into, but, you know, here's an unformed thought. There it is for you guys, unformed thought. What would it mean to live into our own mortality?
I think my takeaway is, and I don't know if that's really human nature. As a philosophy minor, we spent a lot of time discussing the state of nature and what human nature is. I'm not convinced this is it, that we witnessed in the movie, but if it is, I would be more worried about the end of the world coming, not for the actual disaster that's befalling us, but by the reactions of other people. I think that would be much scarier than anything the world could throw at us.
Yeah. No. Hopefully we won't find out anytime soon. Alright, so those are our thoughts about these final hours. Please let us know your thoughts. I guardedly recommend this film. Carson recommends this film. So check it out. Check out novitovideo.com. You can let us know comments there. You can let us know comments here down below. Please feel free to do that. We'd love to continue the conversation with you guys. So there we go.
Mm-hmm. It's time again on No Veto Video where we tell you our override recommendations, where we watch the movie and then say, no, I think we should also consider this other movie. And my pick this week is Wormwood Road of the Dead. It's also an Australian movie. Instead of a natural disaster, it's dealing with the threat of a zombie apocalypse, but there are still some of the same things in it that I liked in this. There's some interesting cinematography going on, even though it's vastly different than this. It's more of a comedy than an actual horror, whereas this is a drama. So if you prefer comedies to dramas, maybe that would be more your style.
Yeah. Alright, so my override recommendation this week, actually, I have sort of one and then a cheat. So let me start with the cheat. It's a movie that I actually haven't seen, but I think might be a nice companion piece to this one. And that is Looking for a Friend for the End of the World, which came out not that long ago.
No.
I don't know, but sort of has that same sort of, how do we want to spend, time that we have left. Haven't checked it out. Can't recommend it or not recommend it, but I'm interested in it. I think it might be an interesting thing to check out. My actual override recommendation for this week is The Wiz, the musical based on the story of the Wizard of Oz. You can check out Wizard of Oz as well. I think they both answer this question a little bit differently. And it's a question that this film also touches on, which is that idea of how do we know where it is that we're supposed to be or what we're supposed to be doing. For me, the answer in The Wiz is a little more compelling than the answer in Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz may be a better fit, though, for the way that the question's asked in this film. But yeah, so...
Well, and the use of color also would be a better fit for this.
Maybe. Okay, so next time on No Veto Video, we will be checking out Miss Hokusai, which was available on Netflix last time I checked, but it may have moved around a little bit. It is a film from 2015. So watch that and come back and check it out along with us next week.
Thank you for watching, and please subscribe down below.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.